Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for being here. I'm very happy to introduce our keynote, and especially very grateful that he was able to do that on such a short notice. Mm-hmm. It's not a small feat. So, 2-3 days before?
2 days ago.
Pretty much. He's like, hey, can you just give a keynote, tomorrow, right? So, Dr. Odegaard actually is a professor of psychology here at MTSU, but he's also the holder of the chair of excellence in dyslexic studies. And as the leader of the Center for the Study and the Treatment for Dyslexia, he's obviously at the forefront of advocacy and research in literacy. So he's published obviously a lot of paper on that topic, but he's currently also the editor-in-chief for the journal Annals of Dyslexia. He's lended his expertise to other journals, like the Journal of Learning Disability, I think, yes. Right? Has received a lot of different distinctions, including from the International Multi-Sensory Structured Language Teaching Council, something like that.
That would be it?
I know there is an acronym of 9 letters. I think I got most of them.
They did.
Right?
We just like MSLIC.
Right. But also is a lifetime member of the IDA.
That's right.
And that's usually something that you get as a recognition, actually, for your contribution in the field. What else?
Well, we're good.
We're good? I'm trying to remember what else we have in there.
I would like to say I did get an award in honor of one of my mentors, Lucius Waite,
yes.
who was part of the co-chairs that drafted the first scientific definition of dyslexia.
Yes. I know there was something like that in there. Yeah.
I am.
So, yes. So I could go on, obviously, there is a lot more, but again, very grateful that he was able to step in on such a short notice, and you'll be learning a lot about all what he's been working on. So again, thank you and welcome for doing that.
Thanks, Cyril.
Yeah. You need this one? Or?
I'm good. No, I'm good. We'll need that later. And thank you guys for still showing up, because I felt like earlier, I know everyone is here to see Dr. Marianne Wolf when I was presenting with Marianne, and I'm a poor substitute for Louisa Moats, but I'll do my best to try to do it. I did write a presentation that was like 20 years in the making, and it really is in the spirit of Louisa and showing some of her pioneering thinking about the integration of language and the foundations of this. I was encouraged to do this by 2 different mentors of mine, Dr. Valerie Reyna, who none of you will actually know, but she's actually really important when it comes to educational science, as well as kind of efficacy research, because she helped to set up the Institutes of Education Science as a Deputy Secretary of Education, as well as the What Works Clearinghouse. She's also a leading cognitive scientist, and when I let her know I was gonna, in my postdoc, which she was one of my sponsors for my grant that I got from NIH to fund my postdoctoral fellowship, she really thought that it might be important for me to kind of take my cognitive science background, the fact that I'm not actually first and foremost a literary person. I was trained as a developmental cognitive neuroscientist, and I take a life-pans perspective to what I would prefer to not say the science of anything anymore. So we'll just say learning science, although I've got a direct quote that'll say the science of learning in a second. And then she really thought that it'd be important because of what I was sharing as I was transitioning and I was working under a second mentor, Dr. Reed Lyon, and Reed was funneling me things to read. It's like, they're kind of missing the point of psycholinguistics and kind of what we know about how learning works here, because they're in this dichotomy of either implicit or explicit. And they're kind of demonizing implicit because they maybe have lost in translation what that means. And I want to explain that, because what I'm definitely not advocating for is that we should ditch direct instruction and just put people into whole language and just let them discover everything. That's not what I'm saying. What I will share with you is that we've known for quite a while that there's complementary learning systems. They sometimes are antagonistic, but we don't have to go there. Parallel learning systems. And implicit learning is always running in the background. And so if you're engaged in direct instruction and you have thoughtful, structured practice, one of the most important learning outcomes of that practice will be tuning and fine-tuning implicitly the structure of the language you're learning. And that's really key. The other thing that I think that we kind of have gotten like a little overboard with is how much society and the fact that spoken language as a human ability that distinguishes us in the animal kingdom which is a few 100,000 years old, is something that we actually are programmed to intuitively structure its presentation to in children. You know, we're teaching them words, right? We're isolating words. We're speaking what culturally we call motherese around the globe. And so we're actually intuitively wired to structure how children are being exposed to certain things. And I think we underestimate how much we intuitively are engaging in a very structured manner to help children acquire language. Now, yes, it does seem very natural, but that language development continues into formal education. And that elevated language use is benefited by continued structure, which is not as hardwired into us as a species to do, which should be thoughtfully thought about. Those are two different distinctions that 20 years ago I was grappling with and saying, I don't quite get this whole reading thing, like how they're talking about this and how they think the learning sciences relate to it. So what I'd like to highlight here, and really I was thinking about this most recently with a writing I did with one of my colleagues and collaborators, Dr. Megan Gierke, with a systematic review we did. It's a perspective review, so we were able to take a position on this, but we systematically reviewed kind of the research behind the learning science perspective and we placed it in a structured literacy context. Now, structural literacy is a very specific term with a very specific meaning, but it is grounded in what we would call more broadly direct instruction, which is an explicit way of teaching things to help children acquire literacy. And what we were starting to talk about was that we kind of think that maybe things are getting lost in translation, that maybe we should help the field understand kind of a broader, more general sense of how learning systems work in the brain. And this is important for us to think about. So then what is this? Oh, I want to say a science of something. Because, and I'm really worried about this, and I've talked to Nell about this, is I'm really worried because I had my mentors tell me 20 years ago, it's like, yeah, you're seeing something that we've been seeing. Maybe you should speak up. And then I was on a call with Sharon Vaughn, and Sharon Vaughn's like, Tim, are you ready to talk? And I'm like, I'm still not sure. We need a framework, and I don't see a good, solid framework to help us bridge this gap. We haven't engineered the solution to communicate this yet. And I don't have the answer for you, but I want to start trying because I'm worried, like it often happens in educational spaces, that other people might try to fill the vacuum. And one of the humbling things about developing domain expertise is you start to know what you don't know. And then we have this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which we've learned in psychology, psychological science, which is those who know less think they know a lot. And so some of us who are the most quiet in the room, I saw Jen Stewart over there, and I think of my friend Stephanie Alateva, who is the most quiet, soft-spoken person I've ever met, who knows so much about RTI, MTSS, and literacy and development in general. But she's one of the most quiet people that you ever meet in a room. She's not the loudest. But maybe we should start lending our voices a little bit more. I found this bibliographical review of kind of where the science comes from, and I found the definition. Definitions are helpful. So really what we're talking about is like the underlying bases of learning. And it's multidisciplinary, just like when we talk about the science of reading, or this program for matter, we're interdisciplinary. So it's an interdisciplinary study. What they identified was, here are some of the heavy hitters. Like Cyril, I'm a neuroscientist, trained as a neuroscientist. I'm also trained as a cognitive psychologist, like Cyril is. And also you'll see psychology is down there, and you'll see kind of where the literature is being cited. Now, as a developmentalist, I was bummed that so little is taking this direct developmental perspective. I think development is key. I think about the developing organism across the lifespan is key as well. But these are kind of where the research is coming from that we would call the science of learning. Now, you may know there's myths in this, and I actually be giving back in Texas as I was a professor of psychology there in my undergraduate cognitive science class. You know, these are myths that still persist. There aren't learning styles. You know, you're not a visual learner of things. Actually, as we'll talk about later on with one of the things I'll highlight from literacy instruction that's helpful sometimes, is visual memory is better for all of us. If you can see and you can see the pictures, it actually is beneficial. Pavio back in the 1950s demonstrated that effect. The picture superiority effect is what we call it in memory. Not controversial, not something we get hung up on. It makes it more distinctive. And that's a key aspect that we've learned about learning and memory. Distinctiveness matters. And why does it matter? Because forgetting is often about accessibility. Can you access the information? Not about availability. That's Tulving and Pearlstone from 1968. That we're forgetting happens isn't that it's obliterated from your mind, your retrieval pathway isn't giving you access. So when a child is stumped and you're using a direct, explicit way of doing it, retrieval pathways are really, really helpful. And as we'll talk about, in literacy programs, especially the foundational ones, we often give visual cues to help them with that. And that goes back to the research of Pavio from 1958 and the picture superiority effect. And that is grounded in a mnemonic that the Greeks used. Partial use of the brain capacity, use all of it all the time. It's a good thing we do that. I mean, we may not like what comes out of someone's mouth, but they're using their brain. Well, I'm a kind of in the middle kind of guy, so I don't care who's talking at what time. I'm probably not going to agree with most of it most of the time. So experts think differently. That's a misnomer. Experts have more knowledge and organize their knowledge differently. They pattern recognize more quickly, and they see things differently. But they don't think differently. The same systems are undergirding it, and that's key. And elements here, and that's central to comprehension in adults and in children. Cognitive development progresses in stages. I always like to say that there's this really fun developmental cognitive paper from Bjorklund from the mid 80s. And there was this time when one of my other mentors, Chuck Brainerd, and then Linda Siegel, and then Bjorklund, they were trying to move cognitive development away from the Piaget models. And what Dave had was this really fun titled piece, Piaget's dead and I don't feel so good either. Because paradigm shifts are hard. And what we were trying to move cognitive development at the time was away from this idea of thinking that there's these stages that we progress through, that you move wholeheartedly out of one. Well, really they're phases, or maybe you're enamored and you like the most recent seminal paper from Maggie Snowling and Charles Human, you like wave theories, but those are a little bit different and they're not quite as rigid as stages, and they have a different mindset to them. One, you can always revert back to an earlier phase or stage when you can bring in processes to help you out. So, I mean, here's the one that I kind of was stuck on, which is in education and in literacy and what I was reading, going all the way to Labarge's research of cognitive load theory when it comes to literacy and why we have to become so automatic with the word strands. Looking at Hollis's bloody rope, and it gets more automatic on the bottom, but more deliberate on the top. No, it gets more automatic on both strands, and you have to be thoughtful and deliberate on both as needed. Now, Hollis didn't like this 10, 15 years ago when I said, your rope is wrong. She just said, shh, Tim, this is a conversation for over beer. And it's like, I got an issue with alcohol. Let's not do this over beer. It doesn't end well. So here's what I'm getting at. Thanks to a transition that happened in neuropsychology, the field of using testing and neuropsychological testing to kind of peer into cognitive function and the well-being. It's a big part of the testing field. We started to learn that there's dissociations. Behavior starts to dissociate. Famous case study happened named HM. HM in his youth had grand mal seizures. They were really hard on HM. And as a result, they wanted to do something operatively to help him with his seizures. So they went into an area in the medial temporal lobe, hippocampus, perihippocampal formation. And at that time, we'll get rid of it. So they went in and they removed completely left and right hemispheres in the medial temporal lobe, his hippocampus and the perihippocampal formation. After that, he woke up and he became one of those classic case studies that we now see in movies. Like Memento is a good example of this. Or I think in an Adam Sandler movie, there's one about this too. I mean, the one he does with Drew Barrymore was like the 100 First Dates. She can remember a full day, but that's not how it typically works. He actually visits a patient, I think his name was Tom, I don't think it was Tim, in the kind of the outpatient, or the daycare service that Drew's character would be in, and he would forget that he met you just 5 seconds later. This idea of what consciously he's remembering and his ability to remember episodes or facts about the world for HM was gone. So he could remember everything pre his operation, but they started to learn that he could still learn new things, especially procedural things through this thing called implicit learning. Now, implicit learning wasn't new, per se, but it hadn't been thought about in this kind of way yet. So it was really important for us to kind of have this distinction. And what you have up here is you have this idea of non-declarative and declarative. Now, I'm going to come back to Louisa, and I'm going to keep trucking through these things because Louisa Moats in 1994 in a seminal paper used the word declarative knowledge intentionally and purposely, referring to teachers' knowledge of literacy. And guess what? Teachers lack that. Guess what? My research lab and many others have replicated that finding ad nauseum, that when it comes to declarative knowledge that you know about the world and can declare about literacy, reading teachers commonly have limited knowledge about the structure of the English language and how it works. But there's this implicit form of this non-declarative, and that's your ability to do things. So in philosophy, Wittgenstein made this distinction classically in a series of lectures he gave at Oxford University called the Brown and the Blue series. There was other philosophers who made this distinction. And then in science, we started making this distinction as well. I like Endel Tolving's research quite a bit. He was a really important influence on mine, and he makes this distinction between remembering and knowing, which harkens back to Wittgenstein's thinking a little. But it's to know that and to know how. That's an important distinction. So some things you can declare. I know this about the world. Last time I checked, George Washington was the first president of the United States of America. We have a constitution, last time I checked. I can declare these things. I know these things. Murfreesboro used to be the capital of Tennessee. It's a fact I know. Fun fact. The geographical center of Tennessee, if you want to say that. Fun fact. Then there's things that are non-declarative. I get hung up if I try to tell you how to ride a bike, or I'm in training my 15-year-old how to drive a car. Trying to describe how you do things that you know how to do is sometimes very challenging. These are non-declarative things that you can't do, but you can show that you can do. Here's some examples. This is knowledge of facts or events. Facts or events. We have semantic memory, knowledge of facts, and then episodic memory. I love episodic memory. Totally love episodic memory. Develop paradigms and ways of studying episodic memory when I was a graduate student. Love episodic memory. That's like your autobiographical memory. You relive the experience in your head like it's a movie. But then there's also semantic memories, knowledge about the world. H.M. couldn't make any of those things. But what H.M. could do was he could learn new procedural things. He could learn structurally how things worked over many, 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 many observations and trials. There's these parallel learning systems here. Rumelhart and McClellan in the early 80s called these complementary or parallel learning systems. They highlighted one was fast and one was slow. Fast, the hippocampus, prone to forgetting, disruption. Slow, which takes lots of feedback and learning from exposure and feedback through small drips of dopamine is the way that we know neurologically. That's why the striatum is important neurobiologically for this type of learning, is really critical and key. Lots and lots and lots and lots of practice to get the implicit system to learn. And they run in parallel. It's not like stages. I move from explicit into implicit or implicit to explicit. They're running at the same time. So if you teach a kid explicitly, one of the sounds that A can make is ah. That's a piece of knowledge. They can declare about the world. They can remember, and they sometimes forget. Especially those of us with dyslexia. We wake up in a new world every day. Now, fun fact, Nicole Landy and Ken Pugh did some consolidation research looking at when we consolidate those types of memories through sleep. They showed that after sleep, some of us with dyslexia don't consolidate memory as well, suggesting that there might be some disruption to how we learn those types of things. Classic study that Nicole did. How to articulate and pronounce an ah or an aw or or an A. There's another sound that goes with that letter. There's 5 of those sounds. It's something that you don't think about. Motor memory and procedural memory that you just do. You couldn't describe how you're making that articulation. And in fact, those of us who are trained to try to use articulatory patterns to train kids, it's hard for us to do and try to mirror them in their way through it. You don't think about doing the act of pronunciation. But I can easily state what I know declaratively, and I can show you how I can do something that I learned through this. What color is the sun? It's a fact. Last time I checked, it was yellow. Grass in the winter, even in Tennessee or Florida, mostly green. At least my grass is. Fire engines, typically red. Best color is chartreuse. From a perceptual standpoint, fun fact. Most common star, I knew that I had learned this factoid at some point, but for the life of me, I couldn't remember it. Red dwarf. Most common sun. Flightless birds, I personally prefer penguins. They're my favorite. Not the only one, no, but I like penguins. So when I was doing that, I was retrieving facts that I had been exposed to at some point in my life through this declarative learning, declarative memory system, through controlled processes. I was guiding and controlling and trying to pull that information out. Name the color you see, now quietly to yourself. Now, my colleague Ola did this for some of us at Big Sky. I rocked this task because I suck at reading. So just know that I'm going to beat all of you unless you two suck at automaticity in reading, but I rocked this task. I was stomping Tiffany Hogan this summer. All right, there's that color. Just kind of quietly to yourself. All right, easy peasy. Congratulations. Mary Ann Wolf would be happy. You can do rapid automatized naming of colors. Congratulations. Read the words you see to yourself. Congratulations. You probably all were able to read those without a hitch. Congratulations. Name the hue or color you see on the screen. Oh, I rock at that task because I suck at reading. Because they're both automatic processes. You didn't think, because of all of the learning that's happened, the stimuli evokes a response. One of my academic grandfathers, just once removed, is a guy named Underwood. Underwood famously came up with something called an implicit associative response. Before HM, already using implicit in the literature. What that means is that things that we've learned associatively to this level of automaticity are evoked without controlled processes. There are numerous famous paradigms in memory and learning coming out of the late 60s that demonstrate this fact. It implies also linked to language and linguistics. So there's also classic studies that show that inferences for many of us are obligatory and automatic. As Amy's meta shows, they're not always for everybody. And so directly teaching them about inferences and how to make them, actually from her meta says, is better for all kids. Kids who have a language problem and those that don't. So you're not thinking about that. That's not an automatic thing. Now, from this 2026 review paper, we came up with this kind of way of thinking about these systems as they relate to language and learning. So long-term memory for words, meanings, factual knowledge, and language concepts organized by relationships between ideas rather than tied to specific experiences would be semantic. Episodic memory here is this long-term experiences for events in like the time and place. And it's like you might remember where you learned the fact. The procedural, those are the procedural memories, like that articulation that I'm doing, or the motor control to procedurally write with good penmanship letters, or type, procedural. And then priming and perceptual priming, really important for language development. Safran's research at the University of Wisconsin is key and critical here for early acquisition of the speech structure in stream and those distinguishes between the word boundaries. She shows that this one type of learning called statistical learning is key and critical. Also for tuning the perceptual hearing of the words. Her research and others show that when we are born, we're the universal listener. We can hear all the sounds spoken in all the words for all the languages. But by 9 to 10 to 11 months in a preferential looking task or sucking task, because they like novelty and they'll suck harder on this pacifier when they detect something, or they'll look preferentially at something when something changes and they can detect change. But if you present a phoneme previously from a Hindu language, which is not in English, to the child, they do not differentially shift their gaze or they don't suck harder for novelty. They're fine-tuning through observation and hearing the perceptions of their language. That happens for orthography too. Over many exposures. What I think we often fail to realize is that indirect pathway there. That through explicit teaching, through effortful controlled strategies, We get something like the self-learning hypothesis that David Scher proposed so many years ago, and that supports what Linnea Airey calls orthographic mapping. We don't get to automatic word recognition, and we don't start to transfer abilities and skills without the fact that we have the ability to self-monitor. And some of us, like those of myself and my brother and my son and my sister and others who have dyslexia, we don't do that so well. Because it's hard for us to engage and use those because of various breakdowns in our language processing centers that we have. But it means that we need extra scaffold and support for doing that. But not everybody does. And that once you teach them some, they can actually start to use that in scaffold. But direct instruction, is all the metas show, is going to be really beneficial. What might this look like in literacy instruction then? First, we're a couple paradigm shifts here. For some reason, I don't know why, people really want to talk about the science of learning, so I'm here. Sorry, I showed up. 20 years in the making. I was told by two different people who I respect immensely that I should have been talking about this 20 years ago. So here I am. And people wonder why I get grumpy sometimes. But the second paradigm shift is that language is really critical. It's the foundation that we build this on. But Louisa told us that in certain ways a long time ago. And other people have told us this for a long time, and we've got new models. I've got recommended readings at the end of this, and I've got some links that you can use in this presentation that'll be shared out, that you can access the languages reading model from Maggie and Charles. You can access, and you'll see that I recommend that you read Speech to Print and other seminal pieces about this. The other thing you're going to notice is that this is my own representation. I fought for 12 hours with AI and just gave up and started doing it all in Photoshop and Adobe products. But this could be Young Suk Kim's, who's a former keynote for this event. This could be her reading house and her model. This is based off of shared knowledge. This is not proprietary to me. You don't see my bloody name down there, and I'm not copywriting it. This is the knowledge of the world. That spine is the shared infrastructure of reading and writing, built on the foundation of language development. And that is a fundamental paradigm shift. I am supposed to have a reading disability. I do not. I have an issue at a lexical level that we call dyslexia, which impacts my ability to spell words accurately and read words accurately, that then manifests and continues across all orthography as an issue with my ability to automatically pronounce words. That is what dyslexia is, and that's what we've called it definitionally up until about 6 months ago, where we put an and or between accurate word reading and spelling for some reason. But all the way back to 1994, every consensus definition had it being a lexical issue that impacts accurate reading and spelling. Becky Treeman published a latent analysis of data from upper elementary and in the middle school, showing a latent construct overlap. How much do these things relate of 0.98 between accurate word reading and spelling? She called it in her paper with her co-authors, two sides of the same coin. What that's important from a scientific standpoint is that showing that the constructs overlap. Young Suk Kim has been showing research with Steve Graham and others for quite a while, showing that a lot of the shared infrastructure, like needing to know elements about genre and tracking and monitoring, and the ability to use effortful, well, that's on the next slide, control, is shared between reading comprehension and writing. Going back to some of the earliest meta-analyses, studies of studies, we know that what Becky's showing isn't just at a constructual level, but is actually important from a teaching and instruction level. When you teach with direct instruction in spelling, and you get within the words, the phoneme grapheme level, and the shared overlap here, you know what you improve? Word reading. You know what you happen if you teach written expression really well through multiple meta-analyses that have been published right now? Guess what gets better? Word reading gets better. Oral reading fluency gets better, and so does reading comprehension. That's critical. Now, an important thing that when Steve Graham published the first meta-analysis on this back in 2011 with Heber was that practice alone and the amount of practice you had with written expression wasn't what drove their effect. It was having the explicit instruction in the text features and how you do it, or down to the mechanisms of how you do it, as Louisa always started with her first publication in Annals of Dyslexia, showing this interface and the importance of getting inside the word to look at spelling is critical to understanding reading as well. It's practice plus instruction. And once you've got the instruction, more practice matters. I'd say the same thing's true for reading development as well. What are we not getting enough of? Well, Jeannie Wanzak and Stephanie Alateba showed that we were only getting 3 to 5 minutes of actual connected text reading in classes. Shane Piazza just replicated this and shows that the most struggling readers got more time in SPED, and that was 8 minutes a day, versus 5 minutes a day in Gen Ed. That's the takeaway message, is they're not getting enough time reading. So what I want us to think about is that direct instruction is needed and mediates your ability to benefit from lots of practice. And that is key. This is the graphical organizer to help you kind of see some of these pieces. And let me tell you, AI cannot generate that because it's stupid and wanted to keep making the text features things like headings and bold words, which are not what you want. Yeah, no, Amy's right there. No, I want characters and setting and events for that genre. I want to know facts and details and causes. I want to know claim, evidence, and counters for the argumentative. And you know what Steve's meta did, and then the follow-up that Michael did by himself with other people, showed that teaching those types of features in written expression is key, and doing it helps reading comprehension and reading. That's central. Here's some of the research that's come out in this paradigm shift we're in. There's Becky's study right down there, 2025. I used part of the Colorado twin study data. So you see that Dick Olson and Bruce is on this with Eric there. You'll see Young's here and featured prominently. And yeah, Amy, it was the 26 paper I was citing over dinner last night. Longitudinal study showing this interrelated development over time of reading and writing on these shared foundations. Here's a spelling meta. Now, I always cited Patricia Mathis. Patricia with Bev Weiser did the first systematic review of this literature back in 2011. But Steve, I think, did one of the first, if not the first, meta on the impact of direct spelling instruction into reading ability, word reading ability. And then you'll also see that a most recent one up here is 2025, and then Chandler up here did a great study, and replicating what I've been highlighting, and some of the other ones kind of were alluding to, is the only time we see word reading accuracy improving when it's spelling instruction is what Louisa would said we should have done. And actually, when you look at, and you read this paper, Steve cites Louisa and says there's 3 different reasons why writing should probably help reading. It's because they share the same mechanics, and so when you directly and explicitly teach them those mechanics in that way, it should improve their ability to use those mechanics for the reading side of the rope. And that's really key. And what Brendan showed was the mediation analysis in this analysis, what really mattered to drive reading instruction was when the instruction got within the word. Which if we go back to my graphic, you'll see the shared thing here between the reading and the spelling at this sublexical level, going up to that drives the lexical level, are these in an alphabetic writing system, how the sounds map to the letters and letter clusters. And that's what Brendan's mediation showed in his meta-analysis, which is what Louisa's hypothesis was when it came to the mechanical underwritings and underpinnings of the relationship between reading and writing. So there's a little bit of recent research, and you'll notice that most of it's new. And we still argue about it being a reading disability. Now, I'm also talking about this because I did a webinar, or I did a podcast recently with Louisa, and this was part of what we talked about. So I figured I would be here and bring Louisa into the room because Louisa and I went back and forth on these types of issues about why this is important and why we're in a paradigm shift. And language undergirds all of this. Here's the other thing. Hollis's rope is wrong. But Hollis got so much right that she could at least have one thing that probably should be changed on a rope, right? Because she got so much right. But she'd be like, but Tim, I'm not arguing about the automatic activation of this, but it is more deliberate. Well, I would say that when we have breakdowns, when the automaticity runs us afoul, and in the psycholinguistics we have these things in comprehension we call garden path paradigms, where they're going to lead you to assuming the wrong conclusion to the end of the sentence. And then we test to see, can you break out of that automaticity and move up into control processes? And one of the things that's challenging, and this is really detailed, again, you don't see my name on this, I'm not claiming anything. Nell Duke in her active use put control process, but it doesn't say how it really works at a systemic level, at a procedural level. Young puts control processes in like working memory in hers as well for her house. But really where it's important is once you move from this controlled, which takes all this effortful control out of the frontal lobes to do, and we recruit, this is where my lifespan is really important. One of my colleagues who had the Center for Vital Longevity at UT Dallas, Reed and I were at the Center for Brain Health. Denise Park passed recently. Denise proposed, and she was one of the most important pivotal pieces in researchers in cognitive aging. Her model was this compensatory model where you would bring in extra resources for control processes. So those people in her research and intervention studies on graceful aging cognitively would pull in homologs out of the right hemisphere. I have this famous brain imaging study I have from a long time ago that never got published that shows that kids, when they're under load and the task and where's Stuart? And the consistency between the grapho and phonemic, those spelling pronunciation consistencies get hard. They recruit the homologs in the right frontal lobe to bring on extra cognitive resources. Just like Denise has shown with her brain imaging research that aging gracefully cognitively shows that they can do that as well. Study I did publish multiple ways is the pathways that connect that left and right hemisphere are key to responding to intervention for kids with dyslexia. My hypothesis was that you often see that right hemisphere activation. It was only the kids that were activating that right hemisphere activation when they were doing nothing in the scanner, or when they were doing a simple grapheme phoneme mapping task. When they could pull in extra resources, responded better. Because what do you need to do more of when you're doing effortful strategy work? You need more control processes. What do you need when you're letting automaticity take you on a wonderful journey through a book, if I'm channeling Mary Ann right now, to monitor, to make sure that your situational model is accurate. If it breaks, you need to fix it. That's control processing. We're going to use direct instruction kind of here. Here's something that you might know. Anybody who takes the direct kind of approach that's really structural literacy, keywords and sounds. T, top, t. J, G, J. A, apple, a. It's a keyword mnemonic, all the way back to the Greeks, using that picture superiority effect I talked about earlier from 1958 in Pavio. Helps learners remember. When there's a retrieval failure, I can use apple to get to a and a. Because it's an effortful control process. What does that drive? Sound symbol correspondence is for what? An effortful strategy to decode and be accurate. Because decoding is a strategy. And it's effortful until it becomes automatic. It takes lots of practice, especially for those of us with dyslexia. And if you were to look at research and meta-analyses looking across the European languages, the universal signature in the reading domain of dyslexia is that we really struggle to reach automaticity. Hence why I'm great at the Stroop effect. Digraphs. Here's a piece of knowledge that Louisa showed most educators didn't know. When two letters come together to make one sound or phoneme, digraph CH, digraph CH. You know, I can do this all day long. There's the voiced form of that for mother, brain A, how to get a brain in there. Or a trigraph, come on, let's have fun with this. And you know that we would know from earlier work of, let's say, important pioneers like Royal Ailick Cox and her situational reading, or the coding that Becky Treeman has done, that situationally will occur in a very specific word form and context orthographically in the string. Just like digraph CK to go k will appear very specifically in orthographic stream. Typical learners, once you prime their system with some pretty much direct instruction and get them reading, they start to learn implicitly those patterns and those positions. Those of us with myself with dyslexia struggle to do those things. There's a trigraph as well. Linnaeus showed in the early 80s that you could even make this stronger by embedding the mnemonics. And so now all of a sudden the pictures are embedded in the letters or a part of the letters. So she's integrated them. She's helping with what we call associative memory. Where does that associative memory happen? The hippocampus and the perihippocampus. We know that that's what drives associative memory. That's the episodic declarative system. So both of these are helping us have these aids because decoding And what we're using this for is an effortful controlled process until it's not. And it takes lots of practice to do that. Here's a task that Linda Siegel claims that she came up with. And I'm not going to argue with Linda Siegel. You don't win that argument, so don't try it. I know Keith Skanovich has used it. I used this years ago in my postdoctoral and early junior faculty research back in the day. Your job, really easy, left or right, which looks more like a real English word? That's an easy task for you. As my buddy Ken Pugh would say, you did it bloody fast. You didn't think about it. What you did not do was take the time to say, well, there's an onset consonant blend and an R control vowel and a coda consonant. We can code that. What that is us using our human species differentiator of language to tell people what they're seeing. Onset consonant blend. Here's another one. In honor of Louisa, I'd already made these, but still in honor of Louisa, you know, she does these final stable syllables. In Take Flight and others, we actually have more of the final stable syllables that Louisa really focuses on those bowls and doles. What we do in explicit phonics instruction to varying degrees of intensity is come up with verbal labels that take these statistical structures and are crude approximations. They're never exact in the English language because we have an outlier orthography and writing system, which is challenging for us to find all these rules and consistencies in. And so a level of intensity is going to be how much of these rules do we bring into it. This is a meme I made about 15 years ago. Now, as a psycholinguistics, there's a hidden meaning in this because vowels are not letters, guys. They're speech sounds. Because we argue, and this is where I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, over semantics sometimes. That's great. We use this as a placeholder of vowels or letters. I do it all the time. Phonics does not mean sound symbol correspondence. Technically, if you want to be mean about it, it's a way of teaching. And we have analytic and synthetic, right? But we argue about this stuff all the time. We get on social media and have wars over this nonsense. We're arguing over mine's better. But we don't let kids have practice to develop what they really need is to get to automaticity and apply this in classes and rooms. And what we'd rather spend our time arguing about is not how we structure the day, how we get educators like yourself do your jobs better and help you. We argue over my way of crudely labeling this writing system as better than yours. And that's BS. Stop it. It doesn't help us. I was asked by a colleague because they're arguing all the time and they're writing these reaction papers and they're like, well, Tim, we know you won't get in the public discourse. So what should we do? Teach people. Have compassion for people. You guys know you don't have enough time in your classes to work with what you really want your kids to do. So let's think about how we engineer a bridge to that translation so it doesn't get lost. I don't want to hear anymore. We don't have to use keywords for sounds, Ebley. Your approach works. You don't use keywords and sounds. Linda Siegel's like, we don't have to teach all those additional phonics patterns. Well, maybe for not a lot of them. You don't have to teach all the different types of syllables. Okay, Devin, maybe you don't. I hear you. I hear you. But what's the constructive counter to that? Isn't to say that you have the right way of crudely labeling our writing system, but to come up with, well, what do we really do in the classes? How do we really design instruction to be impactful and effective? Coding words isn't helpful. I hear you. It's a way to be accurate and should be a scaffold and shouldn't be 30 minutes of your lesson. Like I observed in a classroom 4 weeks ago when I was visiting classrooms watching. They took 30 minutes, I timed it, to do consonant E patterns for reading and spelling. Yeah, no, Amy's up there cringing. And they didn't bring in other concepts to practice in an interleaved distributive way. I know, cringy, isn't it? I know. It's bad out there. Syllable division rules are pointless. They're complex and tedious, and they're a lot of cognitive load. And so let's say if we were to look at, let's say, a Friends on the Block perspective and Jill Aller's work with Cheatham and others, they want to do light phonics, lots of reading and connected text that are tightly controlled and structured to give that learning system all the observations to apply that. That's based on some really good learning principles right there. And it works really well for a lot of learners who are struggling, especially those with mild intellectual problems. God bless Mark. Phonemes aren't real. Not helpful, Mark. Because we have an alphabetic system, and it turns out that there's a bolus of instructional research that says teaching kids goes with A is helpful. And A has 5 phonemes attached to it. It sucks. I hate A. It can rot in hell. This is just for Amy. Teaching comprehension strategies is a waste of time. Just teach them vocabulary and background knowledge and it'll all come out just fine. How's that working out, Tennessee? I mean, we've moved, 2 percentage points on our third grade reading assessments? Which is what, a comprehension test? Sorry. This is my favorite one. I made this 15 years ago too. And of course, what you see is all the things. So we circle the words that are irregular. I've got the short vowel sound over there. I've got a K back, because this is a K sound. I've got the final stable syllable bracketed off, all to be accurate. That's a lot of time, and not all kids will need that. That's the point that Mark has made, Mark Seidenberg's the Mark, that I think is really important. Finding ways to dial back intensity to rightly dose it for right kids, when dosage isn't just thought about its time, but actually instructional intensifiers, to borrow from Wanzak, Alataba, and McMaster's book on organizational versus instructional. This is an instructional scaffold that if needed, you can pull out to be accurate. But you have to learn what all those codes mean. And so to go to Jill's research on Friend of the Block, or to go to Duff et al., which is a study that Maggie did on persistently reported responders years ago, language problems are hard. And language is a mediator of structured literacy. And we think about this because what have we always said the prototype was? Someone like me or my son, really gifted with language, really good with his oral language piece. So we use that strength in the sea of weakness to aid. But you know what co-occurs with dyslexia a whole heck of a lot? Developmental language disability. Which means that is not a relative strength for these students. And that's a challenge. So I'd like to I know I just made this stuff up. Skills I'm not happy with, but concepts and strategies I'm right on. Skills are going to confuse you, so don't think too hard about them. I'd like just to reframe something. We teach concepts through a declarative knowledge. All these things, like what's a final stable syllable, to keep banting. So knowledge about how the writing system works would be one, or how text structure works. You're teaching knowledge, you're teaching concepts. With that knowledge, you can teach effortful controlled strategies that can be deployed with various levels of scaffolds to apply that knowledge and transfer it to be successful. With lots and lots and lots of practice and accurate practice and feedback, you can develop an actual skill. And that's important. That's why my last slide was like, let's stop arguing about the damn concepts and let's get to how we structure and we apply strategies flexibly in context to get to actual skills. And language is critical because language is really going to be key. Here's different ways that we do this from a word reading, and I put peeling in here for a method because it's an effortful control process that relies on what we call a memory, perspective memory, which is really hard. Remembering to do something in the future is hard. That's why medications suck, and I have too many of them. So we have to get there. But it's not like word strategies from Maureen Lovett's line of research are immune to this whole thing. Their strategies used to be successful. So if we go back here, you see how there's a lot going on here, a lot of interplay. There are a lot of concepts we have to teach. You know, all that knowledge building for the features to drive really good comprehension work, all the knowledge you have to build to really do good writing. Those metas said that when we teach that type of knowledge building and get into the processes and the stuff you need to know, it worked better and allowed dosage and practice to have more of an effect. That's really key. That's true for the writing and the reading side. And it's built off of sub-mechanics and lexicals. I'm going to do this really quick because this is important for us to see concretely. This is a good lesson template from CORE. My buddy Dale came up with this, I'm sure, with the help of probably Linda Diamond and others. But I want us to go through what it does. So here's the develop phonemic awareness, and they're going to work on onset rhyme, segmentation, blending, isolation, eyes shut kind of work for 3 minutes. What's this going to support on that big model? Phonemes, not linked to graphemes, for 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes, though. Well, now we get to something really important, which is review sound spellings. That's important. That's that I give you a sound, how can you spell that sound? What's that going to support? Again, now we're over here to the shared thing, phoneme graphemes. You see what Louisa would say, why this might be a pathway to better decoding. Because that shared aspect of phoneme grapheme correspondence is being reinforced through a phoneme to grapheme. What did the Chandler paper show? It's only when spelling gets within the words and uses this kind of approach that it actually benefited the word reading side for accuracy. Now, blending words is critical. It's a skill that you need to have if you want to use decoding. You have to be able to blend those phonemes together to actually pronounce the word. So some people are going to work on this. 6 minutes. It's a lot of time, guys, and we're still sublexical. All this is sublexical work. We're not at the word, we're not at the sentence, we're not at the passage. Now we're actually going to do automatic practice. This is practice to see a word and read it with automaticity. I'm not going to have you code the word or use a keyword. I'm just going to give you the right word and give you to say it. And we're going to bring in irregular words too here. So now it would allow you to practice in applying your decoding skills, and it also is going to help you with your word recognition. And if you're doing it more independently, that self-teaching hypothesis would say that that's also your monitoring mechanism to monitor your accuracy for yourself. What's most important, especially for struggling readers or striving readers, is to have someone there or a thing there to tell you if you're right or wrong. Implicit learning and learning in general doesn't happen without the dopamine drip. When it gets something wrong, there's a decrease in dopamine availability. That's our neurobiological signal to recalibrate statistical connections and probabilistic learning. And that's what the English learning system is, probabilistic learning. Here we have decodable text for 10 minutes. Now we're at the text level, finally. So now we're at word recognition, decoding is being coupled, and we're doing connected text for accuracy, automaticity, and support of fluency, hopefully. And now we have word work, and this is kind of a choose your own adventure. So it's kind of what you need. This is the differentiator. It could be word or sentence dictation for spelling. It could be word building with cards. It could be word sorts with cards or icon boxes. Not a lot of production there. I'm doing some internal research right now, so I'm developing some stuff. And when I'm looking at computer programs that don't have production, they don't predict better reading and writing outcomes. Because production in language is really, really key. And in some of these tasks, you're using proxies for production and you're not actually having them practice the thing that you want them to do. And so that's key to remember from a learning standpoint. So it could be doing a lot of different things. I have no clue. But here's what I want you to see. I know guaranteed 34% or more of that lesson was devoted to sublexical work. I know for certain that only guaranteed 37% was devoted to actually reading in context. And I don't have a lot of confidence that I'm going to do any kind of reading or writing in context with that last bit. It means potentially the bulk of our time is at the sublexical level in a day. So if we don't get savvy and paradigm shift to an integrated approach to thinking about how this all interrelates across our ELA blocks, opposed to sticking kids on iReady or Alexia and now teaching them different keywords and sounds, which in learning science is going to cause forgetting, it causes interference. It's a problem. You're in foundations and all of a sudden now you're learning something different on the different keyword on Lexia or iReady. That's called interference. That hurts learning. And you're probably going to be using proxies and not production. It means you're not actually reading and you don't have any feedback that's really driving your production in language. And that's, we know, needed is the production. Because we want to go from effortful control to automatic deployment with the ability to check when there's breakdowns and monitor when there's breakdowns. And what does Amy's research highlight, what does my research highlight and others, is that when you have those breakdowns in either the word level, reading, spelling, or the reading comprehension, the striving readers, the struggling readers struggle to do that monitoring the most. often because there's pieces of their language system that are not fully functional intact. And that's important for us to remember. So we teach for automatic activation. So when I say implicit, I mean activation just as much as learning, because I want them to move to that. And the entire idea of cognitive load and literacy that started, of why we want automaticity, the word strand, is based on this model. They just never really honored the fact that we have to have lots of practice to get there, and that a lot of the comprehension stuff is also automatic. Word activation, inferences. Skilled literacy uses parallel routes to learning and activation. That's key. Instruction should align with memory and learning. If we're going to talk about the science of learning, let's honor the science of learning. Let's just don't make it another educational fad that we misrepresent and gets lost in translation. And an integrated approach to literacy development that's built and integrating across language, reading, and writing will be key to making this happen for us in the real classrooms that we have to work in. Because we don't have enough time in the day. And recently there was a post from Tim Shanahan where he's talking about intensification's too much, and he's really talking about a structural issue of time. And I would say that until we get savvy and start integrating across these things, we'll never have the time to do it. I should be reading and then writing about what I read. That's what Steve's method said was most effective. So if you've got a unit of studies here in Tennessee, you should be teaching them how to go and take those things that they're reading about and writing about them. That should be integrated. There should be shared concepts that you're using across how they're tracking for learning in the reading and then the writing for expression in the writing side. That integration helps you use your time better. Your reading should be built off of connected text reading that's coming from what you've been teaching them how to do at a sublexical and to a lexical level for reading and writing mechanics. That's key as well. That integration is going to be key moving forward, and what we do not have is an engineered bridge to do that for us right now in the classrooms. And that's not our fault as educators. But we can demand it, and we can demand that high quality instructional materials are truly high quality and built with a good instructional design based off of what people want to talk about now for some bloody reason, 20 years later after I said we should talk about it, the science of learning. Here's a few things that I suggest you read. You should have probably heard Louisa today. I'm sorry, I'm a poor substitute for Louisa Moats. You should probably read the paper from Charles and Maggie on languages reading and their model, which they highlight is based on research that was funded here in the United States long ago that Louisa was helpful in helping to implement. There's a new book coming out from Young. I read an endorsement for it. Tiffany did. I read it. It's a good book. I think you should read it if you want to learn about this interconnection and the research base for it. This is an important piece that I didn't have time to develop. I like what Sonia Cabal is doing in this piece that she wrote recently for the reading teacher. I like how she shows that if we're going to do dialogic teaching, if we're going to do like using conversations to drive comprehension development, so using oral language, and also using those conversations to elevate and help model academic language and elevated use of vocabulary and academics in the classroom, I think that it's going to be important to have instructional decision points that are non-negotiable. What's the text you pick? Are you helping them understand the genre and the features that you should be monitoring and talking about? Are you elevating and bringing in vocabulary-rich content to those conversations, not just willy-nilly? That's important. That's what Sonia elevates in this piece. My girl Adria wrote an exceptional piece, Adria Truckenmiller, on translating what Steve and Young have been doing so well for educators in a Reading League piece here, talking about that reading-writing connection. I would really encourage you to read Adria's translational piece here. That's the review article that I wrote with my buddy Megan Gierka up there, highlighting these different basic memory systems and those brain circuits I was talking about and how they apply to structured literacy. And then Nancy Hennessy, I can't shout her out enough, but that comprehension blueprint is pretty darn good. And there's even a lecture of her lecturing on it at the Tennessee Center for Dyslexia's website. And if you want to hear her talk about that book and do a book study, get the book and watch the lecture. What I heard from my students, because I make them watch that lecture in my classes, that's not what they're being trained or asked to do in Tennessee schools. And that's unfortunate, because we think about it as being foundational skills and knowledge building. So that's the problem. Anyway, I got to get off the stage. Some of those most of those are available online. So these are the citations and links to things that you can get free of charge. The books, obviously, I can't give you for free. So there you go. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I wish Luis had been here.